Okay, hello. I think we can probably get started now. My name is Dr. Alice Butler-Walk, and I'm a lecturer in sociology here at Robert Gordon University within the School of Applied Social Studies. I organise the school's community seminar series, and I'd like to invite all of you to join us again, but firstly to really thank you for coming along this evening and to welcome you all. We're really glad that you could join us for what I think is going to be a fantastic talk tonight. Just a couple of brief housekeeping things to cover before we begin. There'll be time after Steve's talk for some questions, and I ask that if you have a question, you add it to the chat panel for me to feed on to our speaker, but without us all having to navigate muting and unmuting and all that kind of thing. You can pop your questions in as Steve is presenting, or you can wait till the end, whichever's best for you. This talk will be recorded and will be posted on Robert Gordon University's YouTube channel, so any questions that you post for our speaker will be read out anonymously. So on to today. We are pleased to welcome Professor Steve Toombs, who's a professor of criminology at the Open University. Steve's research is about the incidence, nature, and regulation of corporate crime, and he's going to talk to us today about his work around the Grenfell Tower fire. So I shall hand the mic over to you, Steve.
Thanks very much, Alice, and thanks for the invitation, and thanks to all of you who, of course, I can't see, but I can see some names. So thanks to all of you for coming along in this kind of disconnected but engaged way. I appreciate that. There's better things you could be doing on a bright evening. But thanks for coming along. I should first of all start off with a disclaimer. The flyer for the event, perfectly reasonably, because I think I put it in my description, says that I'll address the concept of justice today. This is only partly true. I'm not going to be doing any political philosophy, so there'll be no Plato, no Aristotle, no rules, no Nozick. There won't be any theories of justice in that sense. But what I want to pose really is a question for all of us to think about, and I don't have the answer to it, although I have some outlines perhaps. But the question is, what might justice look like after Grenfell? What might justice look like for those affected by Grenfell? And in kind of raising some of the issues required to answer that question, I'm going to look at Grenfell through three different sets of lenses. I'm going to look at Grenfell in terms of crime, in terms of harm, and in terms of social murder. And I should actually share my screen, sorry.
That's great.
Yeah. So I just make some prefatory points, really. The first thing to say is that everything that I've written a few things about Grenfell. Everything I've written and the talks that I've given, I'll come to those in a moment. I've only used data that's available in the public domain. So there's a massive material about Grenfell, not least those affected speaking directly to print media, broadcast media, through the digital media. There's the transcripts of the public inquiry have been posted up weekly, if not daily. Actually, I think they go up every day. So there's a massive material. I didn't need to start kind of going and nosing around the Lancaster West estate where the tower sat and start to speak to the affected community. And I had no right to do that. I had no relationship with them prior to the tragedy. I've worked with many bereaved families over the course of 35 years, but I've ended up working with them, having had a relationship with organisations that they've kind of gravitated towards. That didn't happen really at Grenfell. I have met some of the campaign organisations and individuals subsequently, but I certainly haven't used any of those encounters as a source of data. I made that decision immediately, and I don't intend to do that. There's no need to do that, given the amount of data that's out there. It should also be clear that I'm not speaking for the bereaved. I'm not speaking for survivors or the affected community in terms of what I want to say. Although I have said what I'm going to say tonight, mostly to some of them. So it's not that I'm saying it behind their backs either. I suppose the one caveat to what I've just said is, I'm not speaking for the survivors and the affected community. Is I've probably given. I lose track of this. It's nearly 4 years now since the fire. It's 4 years on the 14th of June, so just under 2 months. And in that time, I've probably given 50 or 60 talks about Grenfell, all variations of the same talk. I hasten to add, of course, it changes a bit, but it's the same kind of points really I'm making, pretty much. I gave the first talk about 3 weeks after the tragedy in London, and since then I've spoken at loads of universities, as you'd expect, but also FE colleges, schools, lots and lots of public venues. Spoken in a social club. I've spoken in a maximum security prison, or high security prison, and I've spoken to various kind of trade union and Labour Party kind of meetings. And part of the commitment to do it, not the commitment, the decision to do that is just to make a small contribution to keeping Grenfell on the agenda, in the public domain. It's a very, very small contribution. But clearly over time, with so many other things going on, not least the global pandemic, the community at Grenfell themselves have said, we are worried that we'll be forgotten about. So part of me banging on about this stuff is a very small contribution to that community not being forgotten about. Okay, the basic facts of what happened, I mean, you'll know them, but let me just rehearse them, and so we all on the same page. On the early hours of the 14th of June 2017, so as I say, almost 4 years ago, a tower block on the Lancaster West estate, a big social housing estate in West London, a tower block caught fire. Grenfell Tower housed 204 households, 204 flats. Almost all of them were social housing. There were 6 which were either privately owned or privately rented, but the rest were owned and controlled by the Kensington and Chelsea Tenants Management Organisation, KCTMO, whom we'll meet at various points tonight. The fire was started in a 5th floor flat, an electrical fault in a fridge freezer, manufactured by Whirlpool. The fire spread very, very rapidly through the outside of the building, and it was very clear subsequently and quickly that the ferocity of the fire and the fact it spread so quickly outside on the outside of the building and effectively turned the block of flats into a kiln, a potter's kiln, really, frying what was inside, was as a result of flammable cladding that had been placed about a year before on the outside of the building at the end of a 2-year refurbishment, which finished in 2016. We'll come to some of the facts of that in a moment. Subsequent to the fire, about a year afterwards, well, in fact, almost exactly a year afterwards, in June 2018, a public inquiry was established. The public inquiry is still sitting. It finished its so-called phase 1 in 2020 and produced its phase 1 report, I think sometime towards the end of 2020. It's now on phase 2. Phase 2 has 8 modules. The 3rd module, which is hearing about the concerns of the community and community relationships, which I'll talk about a bit tonight, began on Monday, yesterday. The inquiry is scheduled to close at the end of this calendar year, 2021. It probably won't, it'll probably be later than that. And so it will report at some point, hopefully in 2022. That will then be 5 or 5.5 years after the fire. And there's a reason for there's a relevance to that, which I'll come to in due course. So in terms of what I want to say, I'm going to, 4 unequal parts really. I'm going to say make some contextual points about the tower. I'll say something about Grenfell as a site of crime. I'll say a bit more about Grenfell as a place of social harm, just noting various dimensions of that harm. And I'll conclude by saying something about Grenfell as social murder and ask them what these different considerations mean for justice following Grenfell. So a couple of contextual slides in terms of just to give you a sense of the place and of the relationships and dynamics in and around the tower. Now you may be very well aware, and you may be not aware, so I'll just kind of go through it very briefly. That the 4 UK governments irregularly, not every year, but every few years, determine something called a multi-deprivation index. The multi-deprivation index takes 7 measures of deprivation and tracks them across different communities and different sized areas, and it draws up an index, and basically you can look at the kind of most deprived community in this case in England, most deprived for council ward, or the smallest unit of analysis is something called the lower super output area, LSOA. And so I was interested in the lower super output area, which fell around the Grenfell Tower, and an LSOA, that smallest unit of analysis, covers about 650 households, or about 1,500 people. So it's not called the Grenfell Tower LSOA, but we can call it that for our purposes. And one of the things that the multiple deprivation index does is it divides up different parts of the country into tenths. So you go from the 10th most poorest to the next 10th poorest up to the 10th richest, through deciles. And the point of me rambling on about this is to say the small area in and around the tower is one of the 10th most deprived areas in England. It's the 10th poorest if you take all of these 7 indices of deprivation together. So it's poor. It's absolutely poor in some respects, but it's certainly relatively poor compared to most of the rest of the country. So we're talking about poor people, poor community. The second thing to say about that poor community is that it sits in the political constituency of Kensington, which itself sits inside of a slightly wider local authority area of the rural borough of Kensington and Chelsea. And the constituency and the borough are the wealthiest in England, the richest in England. It's the richest council, and it's the richest local authority, and it contains the richest LSOAs, the richest local super output areas. Kings Road, Chelsea, Sloane Square, those kinds of areas, if you know that part of London at all. So you have absolute relative poverty within enormous wealth, and the kind of what put those two together, and then unsurprisingly the observation, you reach the conclusion, the observation that the Royal Borough of Kensington and Chelsea local authority area, the borough, is the most unequal borough in England, and that's just documented on government's own figures. Not just is it the most unequal borough in England, but it's also since 2010, and 2010 was the year when our political administration changed and the austerity politics began to kick in across the UK. In fact, UK government now. Since 2010, the most unequal borough in England was getting more unequal. The poor were getting poorer, the rich were getting richer, and equality was widening. And this was documented in 2 reports, one just after the fire and one at the back end of last year, overseen by the local MP, or then local MP in 2017, not now Emma Dent-Coe. And she didn't undertake any of her own research, but what she did was she collated all of the report, or a lot of reports about inequality in her borough, to put together this picture of inequality and trends in inequality in Kensington and Chelsea. And she found, for example, that between 2010 and 2017, the gap in life expectancy between the poorest 10% and the richest 10% in the borough in 7 years had grown by 6 years. Yeah, the richest were living 6 years longer than the poorest after 7 years of growing inequality. And that meant that the richest 10% in the borough expected to live on average 22 years longer than the poorest 10% in the borough. So, I mean, these inequalities, they have very real consequences, and here they have consequences in terms of people's life expectancy. The second thing to say about the second set of contextual points about Grenfell Tower was that it was a site of very difficult relationships between the residents in the tower and indeed the wider Lancaster West estate in which it stood. And the council and the KCTMO. Tenants Management Organisations was set up in the mid-90s under Margaret Thatcher, under Margaret Thatcher's government. And they were bodies which ran social housing in a borough on behalf of the council. So it was a kind of arm's length arrangements established by central government, whereby local authorities, in a sense, subcontracted the management of social housing, formerly council housing, subsidised housing for poor residents in their local authority area. KCTMO was one of the largest, not the largest TMO in the country. It had about 10,000 social housing residents. But it was a very difficult a very difficult relationship between the social housing residents across the borough and the TMO. And the kind of dominant narrative or the dominant explanation for that is that really the TMO would have preferred to have had fewer social housing residents, and in fact, no social housing residents in what was the richest constituency and the richest borough in England. It would much rather have been able to, so the narrative goes, with which I agree, by the way, would have much rather been able to clear out social housing tenants from the borough, from the area, redevelop the land, particularly in the north of Kensington and Chelsea, where Grenfell Town and Lancaster West stand, redevelop those so that there were more kind of luxury playgrounds for particularly Middle Eastern and Russian oligarch money, which is what kind of dominates much of that borough. Of course, it's also the borough of a royal palace, hence the royal borough of Kensington and Chelsea, and hence the kind of wealth in that borough. So the residents social housing residents felt unwanted. They felt that their concerns were never listened or not listened to by the TMO, and that was one of the reasons why the Grenfell Action Group was formed, a residents group formed in 2010 to articulate the concerns and the views of the residents in their discussions with the TMO in order to have their living conditions improved in general. During the refurbishment of the tower, which took place between 2014 and 2016, the action group became reinvigorated in particular because residents began to be concerned. Effectively, what was happening, the main reason for the refurbishment was a new heating system being put through the tower. But it was also the period in which the cladding was fatally put on the outside. Residents say to make it look a bit better and less of an eyesore for the richer residents as they passed over the Westway, a motorway flyover which passed the estate. Anyway, the action group became particularly vociferous again during the refurbishment because they felt that the way in which the refurbishment was being conducted, the basic standards of work, the health and safety standards of the installations, and indeed of the ways of working, so that fire exits were being blocked. They felt that this was putting their health and safety in danger, to the extent that in 2017, this is hyperlinked here, right? But the hyperlinks won't work through Zoom, so I had posted this in just in case. In 2016, 7 months before the fire, probably the most famous or infamous blog published by the KCTMO, published by the Grenfell Action Group, was headed KCTMO Playing with Fire. And here you see, this is a tower block just down the road, actually, Shepherd's Bush. I'm pretty sure that's what it is. But you can read how prescient the start of the blog is. It's a truly terrifying thought, but the Grenfell Action Group firmly believe that only a catastrophic event will expose the ineptitude and incompetence of our landlord, KCTMO, and bring an end to the dangerous living conditions and neglect of health and safety they inflict upon tenants and leaseholders. I won't read the blog out. You can follow up the link, hopefully. But it concludes, it's there bold, the Grenfell Action Group predicted it won't be long before the words of this blog come back to halt the management, and we'll do everything in our power to ensure those in authority know how long and how appallingly our landlord, KCTMO, has ignored their responsibilities to ensure the health and safety of their tenants and leaseholders. They can't say they haven't been warned, and that's what was happening, right? They were being warned of what would happen 7 months before it would happen. And just before that blog, just before the refurbishment, and this came out very shortly after the fire, prior to the inquiry, it was leaked and it's come out in the inquiry since, and then its veracity has been established, so it's clear in any case. The KCTMO, remember, this is a housing association in the richest borough in the country, a borough which had a council which had reserves of £270 million, a council which was selling off council houses for £4 and £5 million ago. The KCTMO took a decision during the refurbishment to cut costs, to take to a meeting with Councillor Fielding Mellon. Councillor Fielding Mellon was the deputy leader of the council and the head of housing, to cut costs, to replace the cladding that was going to be put on the outside of the building, replace less flammable with more flammable cladding in order to save about £300,000. And that saving went ahead. It was approved by Councillor Fielding Mellon. And when the email came out, of course, and the fire had happened, clearly the relationship with the local people was even more fresh. Come to that in a bit. Okay, so that's the context. Now the three kind of ways in which we might look at Grenfell. The first is as a site of crime. I work as a criminologist, so it's one of the things that I turn to is to think about crime. Now, Grenfell definitely has been a site of crime in some respects, in that lots of what we might call, or I would prefer to call, the usual suspects have been rounded up following the fire. Since June 2017, when the fire occurred, there have been 23 convictions of 22 separate defendants. The number's slightly different because one of the defendants has been convicted twice for two offences of threatening behaviour. He lost friends in the fire. He threatened a council officer, and subsequently he threatened a fire officer, a fireman it was, and he was eventually jailed. Been 23 convictions in all. I just want to show you who these people are who are being banged up. The photos are taken on the internet, and some of them have been kind of mashed up to fit them on this slide, so they look some look a bit grotesque, but you get the point that I'm making. I think this is mostly in order of the convictions. So Omega Mwaikambo was the first conviction, actually. He was convicted, I think, two or 2.5 weeks after the fire. He shared images of body bags and corpses on social media, I think on Facebook and Instagram. Rhys Morris was the guy who's been done twice for threatening behaviour. First of all, he was given a suspended sentence. He was then given jail time. Ayman Zada was a resident of the tower. The police and the fire service, when they were clearing out the tower, obviously treating it as a crime scene initially to recover evidence of how the fire began, a potential crime scene. Sorry, they found trace of cannabis plants in his flat, and he was jailed for having what was called a cannabis factory in court. All of the other people on this slide, including this couple, they were all jailed. They were all prosecuted and convicted, as were almost everybody in this collection of defendants, for frauds related to Grenfell. In other words, what happened was, when the compensation fund was set up and when the council set up schemes to temporarily rehouse residents who'd lost their accommodation, either because they're in the tower or the fingers around it, with flats immediately around it which had to be evacuated and tenants rehoused. People said that they were mostly the frauds consisted of people saying they'd been living in the tower when they hadn't in fact been living there. In fact, most of the people who made these fraudulent claims were living with no fixed abode, were living on other people's sofas or living on the streets. And they took an opportunity. I'm not defending it, right? But they took an opportunity to engage in fraud, to put a roof over their heads and take some compensation. And almost all of them, in fact, I think all of them received jail time. All of these engaged in fraud. You'll notice it doesn't need saying, but I'm going to say it. These are all black and brown faces, right? And as it turns out, if you look at the conditions, or if you look at the circumstances of these people, such as possible through publicly available media, almost all of these people are pretty marginalised. As I said, for example, about not having any fixed abode. That includes Daniel Stevenson, despite the tie, includes Alvin Thompson. The one big exception here is Jenny McDonough. Jenny McDonough was deputy finance officer in the council, and she embezzled £65,000 from funds that have been put aside and also donated by the public for the survivors and the affected community. And when she went to court, she had some other charges laid which related to similar offences when she worked at an NHS trust. She received a custodial sentence. Almost everybody on those three slides were involved in fraud. Almost everybody received a custodial sentence. The sentences ranged from between 18 months to 6 years. Derek Peters got 6 years. He defrauded in the previous slide. He defrauded the council of £40,000 on a hotel stay to which he wasn't entitled. The total jail time adds up to just under 80 years for those convictions. So the point of that is not to say it's okay to defraud the council and the compensation fund, because clearly it isn't okay to do that. But it is to say the criminal justice system has managed to work very, very quickly to clear up the relatively marginalised black and brown usual suspects in the wake of the fire. The second way in which Grenfell might be a site of crime is through the responsibility of powerful organisations and individuals to produce the conditions which allowed the fire to take hold and allowed it to be so ferocious when it did take hold. In other words, charges levelled against the council, the tenants management organisation, and the companies involved in the refurbishment of the tower, which proved to be so deadly by lowering health and safety standards and putting flammable cladding on the outside of the tower. Within a few months of the fire, the Metropolitan Police said that it was investigating these organisations. Ryden was the main contractor. This was a link which had a kind of a visual image. I can't access it. It had a visual image of the companies involved in the refurbishment of the tower. There were about 60 of them altogether. But RBKC, KCTMO and Ryden and about 8 other companies were and still are being investigated for possible charges of corporate manslaughter by the Met Police following the deaths of the 72 residents at Grenfell Tower. Charges of corporate manslaughter have never successfully been laid against large organisations or complex organisations. These would all count as large and complex organisations. There have only been 26 successful charges since the law was brought in. They've all, with one exception, been against very, very small companies, like a couple of blokes running a building firm, for example, is a typical one. It's difficult to imagine the charges will be successfully laid, but I don't have a crystal ball. Let's see what happens. It will be several years down the line before any charges for any of these organisations go to court. It will certainly be a while. It will certainly be after the inquiry report, sometime in 2022. There may be health and safety and fire safety prosecutions of any or all of these organisations. That has happened in tower block fires in the past. If that has happened against the local council, Southwark Council, following a fire in Lacanau House, a tower block in 2009 in South London, killed 6 people. Southwark Council was fined £575,000 8 years later in 2017, the same year as the Grenfell Tower fire. Of course, as a council, it has none of its own income. It relies upon government grants to provide goods and services, and it relies upon community charge payments from its local residents. And so some would argue, I would indeed agree, that fining a council ultimately means the fine is paid by the poorest people in the borough, people who depend most on goods and services provided by, or services provided by the council, and the people who can least afford to pay increased council tax charges. And if this was the most likely, I think, prosecution that will follow Grenfell Tower, and it will hit the poorest in the borough the hardest. 13 senior individuals, we don't know who they are, have been interviewed for possible charges of gross negligence manslaughter. This is manslaughter in which individuals are implicated where they have a duty of care towards somebody who dies. It's difficult to see how they could proceed. I mean, police have undertaken 13 interviews, they said. Difficult to see how they could succeed. They're typically against, cases of medical negligence sometimes gets named doctors. It's a famous case a couple of years ago of a mother who was on a heroin recovery program. She left methadone in an open cup on the floor. Her child, a baby 2-year-old child, drank the methadone. Child died. The mother was prosecuted for gross negligence manslaughter. There needs to be a kind of proximate link between the individual and the death, and it's difficult to see that in this case, not in principle, but in practice. But in any case, the police say they have interviewed individuals under caution for gross negligence manslaughter. Again, there'll be if any prosecution delayed, won't be until after the inquiry is completed. Same goes for, there was a class action, a civil suit for compensation by about 30 of the families bereaved by what happened in the tower. They took out a lawsuit in America, a collective lawsuit for compensation against 3 of the companies, with 2 with headquarters and 1 with significant interest in the US. The judge eventually threw that application for a case out, but said it should, but not saying it had no merit, but saying it should be heard in the UK where the fire took place. Again, if that is heard, and class action suits are very rarely heard successfully in the UK, they are in the US. Then that won't take place until after, that won't kick in until after the inquiry ends. So look, the underlying question here is through these legal processes, and I also include the kind of the effective processing of poor, marginalised people, where justice is going to be found and when it's going to be found in the myriad of legal processes that have and might follow what happened at the Tower on the 4th of June. Okay, so that's Grenfell as a site of crime. Now I want to switch to talk about Grenfell as a source of harm, and I'm going to say something about 4 different kinds of harm: physical harms, emotional, psychological harms, financial and economic harm, harms of recognition, which may not be immediately apparent, but I'll elaborate when we get to that last group of harms. You could cut this up differently. There are other categories of harm. We could talk about cultural harm, is something I've talked about in the past, but I think these are the key harms that have been generated by the fire at Grenfell Tower. And again, I think it's useful to think, as I start, some are really obvious, right? And some aren't. Some require a little bit, some require pointing out. Once they're pointed out, then they're kind of obvious. But I'd like you to think, you can think what you want, right? But the point of this is to think about, how do we secure justice in the context of any of these kind of harms which are being experienced by individuals who survived, individuals around the tower, and indeed individuals who now are or who live many, many miles geographically from Grenfell Tower, and they're harms which in many respects, or some of them, will be felt by individuals, groups of individuals, families, communities for many, many more years, right? And not, criminal justice systems generally deal with events, one-off events. Who is responsible for the fire? Who is responsible for that fraud? When you get into the process of harms, you're talking about processes which unfold over time. They ripple out and affect other people. They can have effects in combination. So if you have emotional and psychological harms, you might cause yourself physical harm through self-harming, right? So these have what is called technically synergistic effects. They act upon each other. And the kind of question underlying me talking about these, partly I want to excavate them, right? Partly I want to bring them to the fore, so we just recognise them. But also I want us to think, how do any ways in which we try to ensure justice fit with what these harms are really kind of getting at and describing. That's kind of the underlying question really for me. Okay, so I'll go through these each in turn. So first of all, Grenfell, of course, generated a whole series of physical harms. It generated 72 deaths. There was a lot of controversy at the time about how many people actually died, because there were clearly people living in the tower who didn't have the right to be there, or who weren't documented as being there. Excuse me. That kind of in a sense, it was that which made some of the thoughts about it, because there was no kind of definitive documentation about who was in the tower, should have been in the tower, was in the tower at that night. But if we say 72 deaths, that's 72 deaths and 72 kind of families affected for the rest of their lives. There were injuries, of course, produced that night. The injuries weren't burns, by the way. The ferocity of the fire was so great that almost anybody who was burnt died. Yeah, almost anybody who encountered the flames died. One woman, the 72nd of the 72 deaths, was a woman who was in hospital for 7 months after the fire. She didn't die until January 2018, but she'd been badly burned. But most of the people who survived weren't burnt. They received injuries to their limbs and to their arms, to their legs, and to their heads. And that was obviously trying to get out of the building in the dark, in the smoke, in the panic, trampling over others and being trampled over as they fell down and ran downstairs. The effects of those injuries, some will have cleared up immediately, right? Some a broken arm, a twisted ankle, that'll be fine. Others to the head, who knows what effects those injuries will have on people for years to come. It's almost undocumentable. Same goes for ill health effects, or the same goes for ill health effects with bells on, I probably would say. We know that people experience lung damage through smoke inhalation. We don't know what their conditions are now, for the most part. We know that people are exposed to hydrogen cyanide. Hydrogen cyanide was one element of a now banned chemical warfare agent of chemical warfare. Hydrogen cyanide was emitted by the cladding panels, the insulation panels, which had been put up under the cladding in the tower. So we don't, and the effects of hydrogen cyanide poisoning are to affect the nervous system, the heart, the lungs, cerebral brain, cerebral capacity. And so again, these just are unknown and unknowable effects over time. They'll get worse over time. They won't get better, right? And the same goes for exposure to asbestos. We know there is asbestos in the tower, of course, given the time at which it was built, late 60s. Public Health England refused to monitor the area for almost a year around the tower for asbestos fibres, but we know people are exposed. 13,000 people a year in Great Britain die every year as a result of past asbestos exposure, mostly at work, but also some families in the household where workers brought asbestos fibre home. There's no cure for asbestos cancers. One asbestos fibre can cause mesothelioma or other asbestos cancers, and they're fatal. So people will die as a result of that exposure. We'll never know how many or who, probably. And it's also the case that people who had health problems prior to the fire are likely to have had those health problems in the short, medium, or indeed long term, exacerbated by the experience of the fire or what happened afterwards, which was notably for the survivors being relocated into what for long periods of time for many people was pretty poor quality bed and breakfast or 2- and 3-star hotel accommodation. As you'd expect, I've made the point at the outset that this was a poor, the people who lived in, they weren't all dirt poor, but overwhelmingly, in general, the population was a poor population, and so they experienced the kind of ill health which is associated with poverty. Things like type 2 diabetes, hypercholesterol, chronic heart disease, high levels of childhood obesity were all known to exist in and around the tower. All of those conditions I've just mentioned can be mitigated through controlling diet, particularly through controlling salt, sugar, or both. And of course, one of the things that happens is when you relocate, well, if you think about it, right, when you relocate from where you live and you cook your own food and you have to stay in a B&B or you have to stay in a hotel and you get the food you're given or you have to go and get takeaways, you have no control over those things, right? You have no control over salt or much less control over salt and sugar intake. So there's good reasons to think that some of those existing health problems are exacerbated. And the community that lived in the tower or communities had higher than kind of average levels of alcohol and drug dependency. And again, one would expect those forms of dependency, given the experiences of that night and the immediate aftermath, to be exacerbated. So there are some very obvious kind of physical effects, but also some less obvious ones. And I think it's worth kind of uncovering some of them. Again, there were also obvious emotional and psychological harms. Survivors talked about their grief. They lost families, they lost friends, they lost people, they lost possessions, talked about pets, which I hadn't really thought about. I'm not a pet person, but people talked about pets as family members, and of course they would do that. Yeah. Possessions and photos. Almost half the people in the tower were born outside the UK, but come to make their life in London or in the UK. In other words, they brought things with them from the place in which they were born, which couldn't be replaced, right? Parts of their origins. And they talked particularly poignantly about losing possessions and photos in those contexts. Grief was caused by, emotional hurt was caused by recalling the horrors of that night. It's unimaginable. I don't know if any of you remember the news reports, but just the news reports, right? Just gruesome and virtually unwatchable. That's why I've never used an image of the burning tower in any of my talks or presentations, just because the image itself can be so traumatic. I'll come to that in a moment. People talked about feeling guilty of surviving. Why did I survive and my husband, my son, my brother, my best friend didn't survive? They feel guilt about that. And some people also were traumatized by when they had to be rehoused, having survived the fire in high-rise accommodation. The council and the TMO rehoused them in high-rise accommodation, which further re-traumatized them. Right? They had a struggle, engaged in struggle with the council or the TMO to get into low-rise accommodation as preference for, as a way of avoiding reliving all of the trauma. So PTSD, stress, anxiety, levels of self-harm, and also suicides and attempted suicides. There are so many reports, in fact, even at the weekend, of actual suicides and attempted suicides by people who had lived in or around the tower. But they're almost impossible to know how much of how many people have lost their lives as a result of surviving. But it's clear that that's happened. By January 2018, so 7 months after the fire, 110,000 people had registered in and around the area. 110,000 people had registered for mental health support. Now, clearly, not all of those lived in the town, not all of those lived on the estate. But one of the problems for the local community, the broader community, and if you've been to that part of West London since the tower, you'll have seen it, is the tower is just visible everywhere, right? And for now, it's clad in nice white kind of cloth and got a green heart at the top and says Grenfell forever in our hearts. It's still the place where people's families and friends died, but it looks a bit better. But for a couple of years, it was a charred, burnt out building. And members of the community talked about, when it's windy, and they were concerned that the kind of ashes of relatives and people they knew and people in that community were being blown across the area. And so the very visibility of the tower, what was called the coffin or the crematorium in the sky by many local people, was a source of ongoing traumatization for people who survived the fire and people who lived around the fire. And then there was trauma which spread out geographically across communities across the UK, when it very quickly became clear that people were living in tower blocks with exactly the same flammable cladding as had been put around Grenfell Tower. And you may have come across this kind of the ongoing Endar cladding scandal. And there was a series of high-profile debates in Parliament 2 weeks ago where the campaign organisation claimed in Great Britain there are 11.5 million people affected by either flammable cladding or, as this is investigated, finding that their high rise doesn't have flammable cladding but has other dangerous fire safety hazards. There are 11.5 million people who claim they need rehousing or they need their flats refurbishment. And the government, despite having said in the immediate aftermath of the fire that money would be no object in addressing fire safety concerns in tower blocks, very quickly decided that money would be a significant object. Then there are a whole series of financial and economic harms associated with what happened. Financial harms, by financial I mean harms which are impacted upon individuals or families or groups of people. By economic harms, I literally mean harms to the wider economy, which again, in a secondary way, impact upon people who live and work in that area. There were costs to households. People who were relocated. They may have had probably had longer journeys to work or school, travel to and from work. They had to eat out. They had to replace their possessions. Some of these would have been compensatable. Others would not have been. They took time off work to attend meetings, to go to funerals, to go to hospital and medical appointments. So there were a whole series of financial costs. There were costs of the local economy. 80 businesses shut down almost immediately in and around the tower and all the livelihoods associated with that. The councils incurred costs, legal costs, fines that may come down the line, as with Suffolk Council, but legal costs certainly to this point, and the costs of attending the inquiry, and those costs I've implied earlier will most likely fall or are falling upon local taxpayers and will most detrimentally affect those who are least able to pay. As dangerous buildings and high rises were uncovered across the country, then some of the costs of kind of refurbishing those or making them safe has fallen on local authorities and has fallen on the public sector. So one of the things that happened within days of the fire at Grenfell Tower was the whole maternity ward of John Radcliffe Hospital in Oxford was shut down because it was found it had the same cladding on the outside. And who replaces who refurbishes local authority? Who replaces public sector hospitals? Local authorities. So again, it's those bodies upon which poorer people most rely, which are having to fund some of the economic consequences of what happened on the tower that night. And the same goes for central government. Central government, to this point, has spent no doubt tens and probably, I don't know, but probably hundreds of millions, given that it's been now sitting for 2 years on the public inquiry. And again, we may not be in a context of austerity, but we're in a context of COVID for sure, you know, and central government funds are of course under pressure. And so paying for the fallout from Grenfell is going to affect the services that could be provided elsewhere. I mean, you know, money will be saved from somewhere to pay for this. And that means that, again, those people who are most dependent upon central government or local government services will be most affected. So all of these are layers of harms produced by the fire, which, you know, once you think about them, are kind of obvious, right? And they will endure over time and they ripple out across the country. But they just need to be noted so that we can kind of recognize that significance. The last set of harms are maybe the least obvious, but I think in a way the most searing and the most difficult to think about. And these I've called harms of recognition. Recognition isn't my term. Recognition was a term, and harms of recognition was a term used by a feminist social scientist called Nancy Fraser. And she calls harms of recognition those harms which she says result in being denied love, being denied respect, being denied esteem or dignity by those others with whom you interact, being not treated as kind of equal or not almost not treated as kind of fully human in interactions with others, being denied the recognition of being fully human or being as human or as those with whom you interacted. She clearly applied that to groups of women in particular. But I think we can see it in the relationships of contempt which existed in and around the borough between social housing residents in general and the residents of Grenfell Tower in particular, and the council and the TMO on the other hand. I think probably the most difficult thing for me, not being directly involved, of course, not being involved at all, is to think of that there was a young man, right, a 14-year-old young man who stood outside the tower as it was burning. 4 or 5 AMEs report the same. A kid who got out of the tower. He said, "We're dying in there because we don't count. We're dying in there because we don't count." And many others have made kind of similar observations in statements and also in popular culture, in songs, in local rapper, in poetry and so on. You know, we're dying in there because we don't count. People realizing that their loved ones died, their friends died, their family members died because a council, which was the richest council in the country, £270 million in reserves, decided to act upon cost cutting of £273,000 to put dangerous cladding on the outside of a building. Council and a TMO, which was so contemptuous of the residents that they just ignored the warnings of what was going to happen. Remember that Casey TMO playing with fire block? I mean, they've been told what was going to happen, right? And they just didn't listen. And residents in and around the area and people who've documented relationships in the area, and again, I agree with this narrative, this version, describe these relationships between the kind of social housing tenants and the people of power in the authorities in the borough as relationships of contempt. The harms of recognition also extended to the ways in which central government in particular, but also local government responded to the fire. What happened when the fire broke out? What happened, in the aftermath of the fire was the emergency services were there right enough, of course. And local people have got a fantastic opinion of firefighters and ambulance staff who turned up, ambulance people who turned up. But almost everything that else happened on the ground was done by self-help. Was through self-help, was done by local faith groups, Christian and Muslim groups in particular, done by voluntary organisations, done by local people themselves. So that people fed each other, they found clothes for each other, they got hold of phones for each other, they set up ways of contacting people who couldn't be found. The local authority didn't do any of this. It was just literally notable for its absence. So absent was central government and local government that 9 days after the fire, Theresa May, then Prime Minister Theresa May, stood up in Parliament and apologised for, quote, the absence of the central and local state when people needed them most, unquote. The absence of the central and local state when people needed them most. The state wasn't there. We imagine the state will be there to support us in a time of tragedy and disaster. It wasn't there for the people of Grenfell. And then they were treated with contempt because they were lied to. They were promised things which never happened, or which took far longer to happen, or which never happened. Half-truth lies were peddled to survivors and the local community by central and by local government, and again by people in power in the local authority area. There were a whole series of lies about rehousing, when that would take, the conditions under which it would happen, kinds of rehousing that people would have access to. It was so people were told it would take 3 weeks. That was never to get into permanent housing. That was never feasible. There were some families who weren't in permanent housing 3 years after the fire. Only just, in fact, there's still 4 families who still aren't in permanent accommodation. Local people were told there'll be a inquiry set up, but they would have a say over who chaired that, over who the panel of experts were, and the terms of reference, what the inquiry could consider. None of those things subsequently happened, or didn't happen in the way that local people, the affected community, were promised. I've already said that there were people in the tower and relatives of people in the tower. There were also relatives of people in the tower who didn't really have right to remain in the UK. In other words, didn't have the legal right to be here. I don't want to say they were illegal, but didn't have the right to remain legally. The Home Office immediately said there'd be an amnesty for anybody affected by the fire, not least because they might provide evidence and knowledge of who was actually in the tower and so on. That amnesty was backtracked, qualifications were put in, and within a year was removed. So people have been forcibly removed from the country before, for example, being able to give evidence to the public inquiry. And as I implied earlier on, government also said that if dangerous cladding and building fire safety issues was found in other high rises across the country, then funding for removal of that would be no object. It would be done very quickly. And still, we're nearly 4 years later, and there's kind of still significant political conflict at the highest level over how that funding, who bears the brunt of that funding. At the moment, it's residents themselves who are being required to pay for people to keep watch during the night in tower blocks with flammable cladding, and ultimately to pay for the refurbishment of those tower blocks in private rented context. And the local authorities are saying they don't have, for social housing, don't have the funds to undertake that cladding replacement themselves. So, harms of recognition, local communities, the affected community treated with contempt. Sure. So, coming to the kind of final bits of what I want to say. Crime, yeah. Harm, yeah. Social murder. What do I mean? So, in the years leading up, the few years leading up to the fire, nothing to do with the fire, of course. In 2016, I finished a book, and the book was called "The End of Social Protection After the Crisis." It looked at systems of social protection, how they've been undone, in particular since 2010, the start of austerity. But actually, I kind of marked it back a bit further, back to about 2004, 2005. Now, by systems of social protection, I was looking particularly at health and safety protections at work, protections in terms of food safety, food hygiene, and also clean air, land, and water, environmental protection. These 3 pillars of regulation of private business activity to protect workers, communities, and consumers have been put in place in Great Britain, first country in the world, because it was the first industrialized country, through the 1830s onwards. Health and Safety Factories Acts through the 1830s, and then food safety and Alkali Acts, which were Environmental Protection Acts, followed that towards the end of the century. And what I documented in that book was how the removal of law, but in particular the lack of enforcement of law, had undermined each of those areas of social protection. It had just simply been taken away. Law was no longer enforced. And I also then, subsequent to Grenfell, of course, looked at what happened to fire safety inspections from the start of that decade through to the year before the fire. Now, there was a massive debate in the book, and it all pointed the same way. It was all enforcement and regulation was all in decline. These are just some indicators. The point of this is, and the point I made in the book, and the reason I started talking about social murder in the book, was to say this: these systems of social protection, health and safety at work, access to safe and healthy food, and access to a clean environment. Right? These are all put in place to save people's lives as Britain was an industrialising economy, because people were dying for lack of these forms of protection, for lack of these forms of regulation a private economic activity. So they were put in place to save lives. So the converse of that then is, as they're taken away, and they were taken away by central and local government in particular, as these systems of protection are taken away, then the consequence has to be that if they were saving lives, taking away of them is likely to cost lives. And this is where I used a term, concept which had been not first coined, but popularized by Karl Marx's mate, Friedrich Engels, in 1845. Engels went to Manchester and he studied what he called, quote, the title of his book, The Conditions of the Working Class in England. And he described social murder. And by social murder, he meant this, or defines it as this. So he kind of says, no, look, the first bit that, there's the murder we all recognize when one individual bodily inflicts bodily injury upon another. We call this deed murder, he says. But then he goes on, it's this bit really where he's defining social murder. But when society places hundreds of proletarians, working class people or disadvantaged people, in a position they inevitably meet a too early death, or too early and unnatural death. He says he says that looks like violence, as much violence as when people are placed under the sword or the bullet. When it deprives them, when a society deprives these people of the necessaries of life, the basics of life, what we need to survive, puts them under conditions in which they cannot live, forces them to remain in such conditions until that death ensues, as an inevitable consequence. This is murder just as surely as the deed of a single individual. So with perfect correctness, Engels says, we should characterize such deaths as social murder. So if you have systems of social protection to stop people dying, and they're taken away by central and local authorities, but they're making conditions in which people live or work or consume worse, whereby illness, injury, and death is likely to proliferate, then the point of the book was to say, we can call this social murder. And that's exactly how I would view what happened at Grenfell Tower as crime and harm, right? But it's also social murder. Think about the KCTMO Planning Fire blog saying, look, inevitably you're going to kill us. And that inevitability, that's exactly what Engels is saying here, albeit in different language. People being forced to live in conditions in that tower, which were inevitably going to lead to their premature and unnecessary death. And that's why I and subsequently other commentators have referred to what happened in the tower as that tower's social murder. And that then raises a different set of questions about how we address that and what justice means in that context. I'll just very, very quickly finish with my last three observations on justice, which I said I wouldn't talk about and haven't really much. And I'll just make a couple of points about it before I close. Hopefully you'll have some points to make about it. I want to say three things about it, and this is based upon my experience. I mean, I've worked with bereaved families, not at Grenfell, but I've worked with bereaved families mostly as a result of having a loved one killed at work, but then more recently working with an organisation which supports families of those who are killed in police custody or in prison, or die in police custody in prison, and just supporting families through legal processes. And I can't speak for those families, and of course they don't all say the same thing, but there are some very common messages which come out of working with those families for 30 odd years in terms of what justice looks like for them. Yeah, it might help us to start answer this question. They want to know the truth. They all want to know the truth. They want to know the precise circumstances under which their loved one or loved ones died. How did X die at work? Why was he on a scaffold which collapsed when a van just grazed it, right? Why was my brother killed when the police stopped him eventually, and very quickly he was shot? Or why was my husband killed in police custody? Or why was he restrained to the extent that he died in a prison cell? They want to know the facts of what happened, right? They want the narrative, they want the truth. It's very, very important. And I know it's important. I said I wouldn't speak for the residents of Grenfell, the affected community of Grenfell, but I know it's important for people who survive and the wider affected community. The truth of what happened leading up to, on, and after that night, that truth comes out as fully as possible. And that's part of what they hope the public inquiry will produce. Second thing most of these groups of people want is, if it appears that there have been laws in place which have been broken by individuals or organisations, that the breaking of those laws have contributed to or caused the death of our loved one or loved ones, then they want those individuals or organisations to be held accountable through legal processes. Not vengeful, they're not being vengeful, I don't think, for the most part in any case, but they are accepting the story that the criminal justice tells us from the day we first encounter it, which is that the criminal justice system delivers accountability where wrongs have been caused as a result of laws being violated. So it's certainly the case that many of the affected community of Grenfell do want corporate manslaughter charges, do want gross negligence manslaughter charges. Some want to take a civil suit, but they want, they want, in a sense, if there are powerful criminals involved, if the council is potentially criminal, if the KCTMI is potentially criminal, if senior individuals in those organisations are, or in Ryden, they want them to be treated as thoroughly as the usual suspects, those black and brown faces I showed you earlier. They've been treated by the criminal justice system. So they want equity of criminalisation, and therefore accountability, I think. And then the last thing I think they want, well, okay, they don't say we want social change. That's me. This is definitely my frame. They don't say we want social change. But what is expressed by almost all of these families that I've encountered and worked with, and had the pleasure to come to know some of them and all of that, right? What's most commonly expressed by almost all of them is some version of this. We don't want another family to go through what we've gone through. Right? We don't want another family to lose a 28-year-old father by being pulled into a baling machine on a farm. We don't want another family to have somebody who's battered to death because he's in the front line of a protest on the streets. But we don't want another family to lose loved ones in a high-rise building because their concerns haven't been listened to, flammable material been put on the outside, and more generally the building's been left in a state of health and safety disrepair. So they want something to change. They don't often, sometimes they say what that is, sometimes they don't, but there is a sense of wanting some form of social change as a response to what's happened, which is something which criminal justice systems tend not to produce, but something which is kind of much more fundamental, of course. Okay, you've been very patient. Well, I don't know if you've been patient, but a lot of you are still there. So I've finished now, and I'll be quiet for a while, and hopefully there'll be some comments or questions. But thank you for listening to that.
Thanks, Steve. That was brilliant. And if people want to pop questions in the chat, we can start putting those to Steve now. So in fact, we have one already. So brilliant talk, Steve. Thank you so much. Do you know much about the immediate response by the community? Did it take on mutual aid characteristics, or was it quite structured? I know that charities and of course the government were slow, but how, quote, flat was the response in reality?
Sorry, yeah, this is not something which I've kind of worked on a great deal, but there are reports. There's a Muslim Aid report. There's also a report by a group of researchers from King's College London, I think, which have looked at the on the ground responses, and there's something which was set up by the government called the Grenfell Recovery Task Force. And if you just Google any of those things, you'll find the kind of, and they report quarterly on responses to what happened. And each of those documents, I mean, voluntary sector and mutual aid and so on is not my area of expertise, but I think that they were certainly in the very immediate aftermath of fire. They were, to use your lovely way of putting it, very flat responses, decentralised on the ground. People kind of engaged in self-help and mutual aid, as you said, and the kind of the most organised form of that organisation was local churches and local voluntary organisations. There's a woman called Claire Launchbury, Launchbury, Claire Launchbury, and I don't know Claire, but I know her work. She's done some great work on the response on the ground as an academic. She's an academic in Leeds, I think. She's done some great work of local people's response on the ground. So I mean, I would my response is to say, yeah, pretty much it was as you described, flat, but also to say that there are other people who can describe that, and other organisations who can describe that in much better detail than I can. So I hope that helps.
Thank you. Okay, we have some other questions coming through, and thank you for that. Is there another act of class violence? Families who have roots in the area were moved out of buildings into Grenfell back in the 1970s. They were moved out of housing that's now worth hundreds of thousands due to gentrification. So I think thinking then, is this kind of connecting into this idea of class violence on a longer scale, perhaps?
Yeah, I think it is, and again, I mean, my answers to all these questions are me saying this is not my area of expertise, but one of the groups of one of the kind of academic groups that's done some really good work around Grenfell have been radical housing people, radical housing academics, and indeed the Radical Housing Network as an organisation which is non-academic but involves some academics, and they clearly locate Grenfell in a long trajectory, and I think rightly, right, I mean, some of the literature, in a long process of gentrification. So there's a great book, if you haven't seen it, I'm sorry to keep saying that titles of books, but these are people who know this stuff much better than me. A great book by somebody called Stuart Hodkinson. It's Hodkinson. And Stuart published something in 2019. I can't remember the title, but it's about Grenfell, but puts Grenfell in the context of housing policy, long-term housing policy, gentrification, deregulation, and also social cleansing, which is what he and other academics have documented. Safest houses, yeah. Thank you very much. Oh, you got it. Yeah, thanks, Alice. It's social cleansing, which is how some of these radical or critical academics, or housing academics, view what's been going on in various parts of London. I mean, the next great movement after, or the next great kind of housing struggle after Grenfell came up in another large housing estate in North London, Haringey, which is very close to where I was born. Not on that estate, I hasten to add. So these struggles are ongoing, and certainly it's clear. Although I don't know them, and I certainly didn't know them before the fire. Right? I mean, I haven't met any of them. It's certainly clear that local people felt that one of the reasons why they weren't listened to was because the TMO and the local authority were finding ways to get them out of the borough. And in fact, one of the final insults, or one of the insults for the local community was that Sir Martin Moore-Bick, who was parachuted in, establishment figure as head of the inquiry, who actually, if I'm being honest, has proven, and I think people would say, has proven to be better than we'd all feared. But Martin Moore-Bick was somebody who'd been relocating people on benefits from central London to places far away as Birmingham and Sheffield into cheaper social housing, because they were essentially not bed blockers, but the kind of social housing equivalent in according to housing terms. So I think there is a kind of much broader tapestry of class violence. I mean, not just about housing, but housing is a key part of that story. And again, Stuart locates it through the establishment of TMOs, but then through the right to buy, selling off of council houses, and the kind of longer term trajectory in terms of the ways in which council house tenants and social housing tenants, particularly in a very rich borough like Kensington and Chelsea, were treated, and still are being treated.
Okay, we have two questions now that are kind of looking forward in terms of what should be done. So the first one is, you rightly highlighted that finding councils is felt most by council residents living in poverty. So what should the response be against the local authority or TMO? Yeah,
that's a very difficult question. Look, I think the only answer, but the very difficult answer, because it goes against the trajectories of what we've been describing, is to allow the kind of establishment or re-establishment in some ways of structures which allow local people great say in the conditions in which they live and greater control over the conditions in which they live. So, finding a local authority is only going to, as you say, it's only going to hurt poor people in that area. But allowing allowing people to have a greater say in how the local authority operates, what its spending priorities are, what its housing policy is, for example, how it supports people on benefits, how it makes nursery and preschool provision in the local area, how it makes access to cheap or affordable or safe transportation. But those things seem to me to be, I mean, on one level achievable, right? Of course, then we have to think of the politics in which we live. But I think the only answer is democratisation of local structures, local services, and that can apply to the council and also to the TMO. One of the when tenants management organisations were set up, some people say they were set up as a way of local authorities over which people have some form of democratic control. They can vote them in or out, right? But local authorities kind of pushing off social housing to a body which wasn't elected, wasn't electable, so therefore over which tenants had no control. That was one view of TMOs. Another view of TMOs by the Thatcher government was that these were bodies which could have residents and tenants on the board, and they would allow much more local control. Now, technically that was the case, but democracy has not proven to be an effect of the institution of TMOs. But it seems to me that these are things that you can do locally, which are responses to, you could have it should appear that the TMO and the council are really not fit for purpose. If they're not fit for purpose, something else has to be put in their place.
Okay, and on that same kind of vein, we have another question about what can be done to ensure those affected by Grenfell get justice and the government is held accountable for its lack of action.
Yeah. I look. I don't think the government will be held accountable. It's the term. I'm not sure what that means, because something like Grenfell Tower was produced by a series of, I'm not getting the government off the hook, by the way, but governmental policy level, what part of what produced Grenfell Tower have been policy decisions taken over 20, 30 years prior to what happened there. I was involved in making a film, advising on the film. I didn't make the film, obviously. The fires that foretold Grenfell, it was about 5 fires that, had the inquiry reports been listened to, Grenfell wouldn't have happened. They go back to 1973. So governments of all political parties were implicated in not acting upon those lessons. So I don't think governments will be held to account. There won't be any, technically, government departments can be prosecuted under the Corporate Manslaughter, Corporate Homicide Act. They won't be. I don't see that at all possible or likely. I think we need, I'm going to keep saying the same thing, we need to find structures or systems whereby people who experience services, or people, workers in workplaces, or consumers in local areas, or tenants in social housing, where their voices are listened to. And had the Grenfell residents' voices been listened to, that fire likely wouldn't have happened, or wouldn't have happened with the same consequences we have. So I don't know what they are, right? But we need to find those systems whereby people's experiences are taken seriously, as opposed to, and this is what the Grenfell inquiry is focusing on just now, starting yesterday. People were seen as nuisances. They were seen as one of the phrases was rebel residents, which was used about the Grenfell Action Group, because they were raising these concerns. They were just a nuisance. Right?
Okay, we have the next 3 things go together quite nicely. So we'll start with one first that isn't a question, it's a comment to kind of add to what you were saying, that Grenfell Tower was refurbished as part of a regeneration scheme for the neighbourhood in which it stood. The regeneration plans drawn up by the council originally envisaged its demolition, as its presence was felt to be too depressing, house values in the neighbourhood. This proposal was abandoned, presumably because it was proved too expensive, and the building was clad instead. Which then leads on to a question that comes next. Your talk was great, thank you, Steve. Do you think this gentrification was, in quotes, deliberate? If this had happened in an area with predominantly white tenants, it would have had far more response and aid afterwards. Could it have been social gentrification to get rid of scheme-like areas to make it more desirable to those with money and social status?
Yeah, thank you for the first comment, not the question. I appreciate that. Thank you for that. And that's well observed, really well observed. Could it have been deliberate? Yes, it could have been. When I'm trying to be a social scientist like I am now, you know, being a bit, I know I try and work with evidence, and you know, it's very, very difficult to have enough evidence, to have the evidence to prove, you know, that allegation really, that this was a deliberate part of ethnic and social cleansing, part of a deliberate strategy. And I don't think that, let me be perfectly clear, and this is, I think, obvious. I don't think that, however appalling they were in the way they treated the residents and social housing tenants more broadly, that I don't think anybody in the council or anybody in the TMO wanted the fire to happen. I don't think any of them wanted those deaths on that to occur. That they didn't care enough about preventing them, that they didn't have the kind of political and economic priorities in order not to make those deaths at some point inevitable. Well, that I can certainly buy. That they didn't mind that the people who were likely to die were, you know, let's face it, in the tower, 80% black and brown faces, families, households, that they were somewhat more expendable than, they were certainly more expendable than the white residents in around Chelsea. Absolutely no doubt about that. So, you know, I think there's some things we can say and some things we can try and argue, and other things which are a bit more difficult to substantiate. But look, I certainly don't think anybody, I think if they had their chance again, those senior people in the council and the TMO would have heeded the warnings about the tower, right? But you know, but that will still be going on somewhere in the country as we speak, right? That's seeing residents who complain, or workers who complain, and we've seen it going through COVID. Workers, and not the least university teachers, complaining about campuses that may not be safe. Yeah, well, they're just getting in the way of life getting back to normal, so let's ignore them, right? That, of course, goes on all the time.
Okay, and that actually connects, this is all connecting beautifully. In your definition of social murder, you talked about actions that would inevitably lead to violent death. But isn't the point that it wasn't inevitable it would be Grenfell, though extremely likely it would happen in one of the many tower blocks with similar cheap cladding?
Yeah.
Is this almost stochastic relationship between neoliberal cost-cutting and specific consequences related to the difficulties of holding individuals responsible?
Yes, I agree. Yeah, I mean, that's the very short answer. But there's a, you know, there's a longer answer. You know, criminal law, and for us popularly, criminal law acts on effects. So let's say deaths caused by intention are always more serious in law than deaths caused by negligence or carelessness, yeah? or even indifference. Yeah? And indeed, that prioritizing of intention is something we all act upon. So, you know, as kids, we've all said, yeah, look, I didn't mean it, right? And I didn't, you know, you've caused some bad thing to happen, but you didn't mean it. So somehow your culpability is lesser. It's just you didn't think enough about it happening. And that's how law works. And you know, there's a criminologist called Jeffrey Ryman, for example, book called The Rich Get Richer, the Poor Get Prison. And Ryman says we could flip those around actually, and you could say that the person who knows that their actions may affect many people doesn't really want to harm doesn't want to harm anybody. But certainly doesn't want to harm any particular individual, as in most one-on-one murders, where they're intentional, right? You know, an individual wants to kill another individual, or acts and kills another individual specifically. No, he says, Ryman says that those people, and he used the example of a coal mine, someone who owns a series of coal mines. He says that they're much more of a danger to society. You could say a TMO, people who own blocks of flats. They don't want Grenfell to go up, or they don't want somewhere else, Shepherd's Bush or Lancaster West to go up. But do they really care enough about keeping the condition, keeping the residents in such a state as to make that less inevitable? Well, no, they don't, and therefore their culpability is at least as much, Ryman would say, as the intentional killer. So I think there's lots of things to play around in terms of negligence, culpability, intention. But I certainly think, I mean, I don't know if you know the comment that popped up about the violence of austerity. I think we need to start attributing violence and murder not just to individuals or to organisations, but to policies, to processes, to systems, to cultures, to attitudes, to assumptions, to ways of thinking. And I think that's what the category of social murder allows us to start to do.
Thank you, and thank you for addressing that one. We've got a question a little prior to that. What's your position toward the omission of the role of race and broader social and economic factors from the public inquiry?
Yeah, I mean, look, housing policy, okay, this is me speaking right now, but housing policy, certainly in London, I mean, generally, I mean, I live in Liverpool, right? It's certainly the case in this city. It's a highly segregated city, which is quite shocking when I came here. But housing policy is as racialized as most other forms of social public policy, as far as I'm concerned. You know, it's no coincidence that there were a group of people in Grenfell Tower who kind of didn't look like me, right? It's not overwhelmingly. That's not a coincidence. The omission of race or racialized policy or institutional racism from the terms of reference of the inquiry was just a part of the kind of long process of closing, sorry, as far as I'm concerned, closing down those terms of reference. So there was an invitation to submit documents as to what the terms of inquiry should cover. I submitted a document. I know many other people who submitted documents which would have opened up the terms of the inquiry much broader, but we all knew in so doing that in fact what we would have was a much narrower set of terms of reference. You know, what was kind of permissible, what could and couldn't be considered. And race and racialization aren't part of that, although they're part of, you know, again, as you'd expect in that area, as in any other part, any other kind of inner city or any other part of a country like Britain, right? You know, built on an empire. You can't understand social public policy without thinking about, for me, race and process of racialization and indeed racism.
Okay, and I think we've probably just got time. We've got some other comments about the TMO ironically being founded as a tenant-led organisation, but degenerated into a top-down authoritarian one. But I think that possibly this is quite a good question to finish on. And we've just got somebody who's posted an article that might be worth looking at as well. But this might be quite a nice one for us to finish on. That thanks for the talk. Like many here, I suspect, the knowledge that there will not be any real justice for the Grenfell survivors makes me feel helpless and angry. And that's as a distant spectator of those events. For those affected and those who are similarly squeezed by neoliberalism, where does this anger go and how does it contribute to the ongoing harms that you described?
Okay, well, I certainly think the harms are exacerbated by a sense at times of helplessness, a sense that no one's listening. You know, I don't think I said this at the beginning. I sometimes do, sometimes don't. But you know, one of the reasons I felt kind of emboldened to carry on giving more or less the same talk for 4 years is that when I met at one time with Grenfell United, they were really into me doing this because they don't want to be forgotten in that terms. They want people to talk about this and to write about this. And so, you know, this is a small bit I can do. But I mean, I think so for sure in the contempt further being displayed towards them by them being brushed away, their concerns not being taken seriously, and everything that's happened since the inquiry and prosecution being kicked down the road. Yeah, psychological, emotional harms of recognition, no, all exacerbated for sure. On the other hand, there have been, you know, there have been kind of cathartic's not right, but I know, for example, because I know they've now just been disbanded in the last couple of weeks, but there were two campaign groups in Liverpool seeking justice following Hillsborough, which is 1996, right? One of the things that happened within days of the fire was the two Hillsborough justice groups made contact with the people in and around Grenfell. And part of that, the reason for that contact was to say, look, you know, okay, you're now going to be fighting for justice. It's going to take a long time. These are things we did wrong, and you shouldn't do them, perhaps. And these are things we think we did right. And that kind of sharing the experience of people who've been, for want of a better phrase, at the sharp end of power, which is what I think we're talking about here, economic and political power. That sharing of experience is something which is kind of on the ground, low level, not very visible, but highly productive. And I think that that's going on all the time. There's not going to be a revolution in 2 weeks or 2 years. I'm not being flippant about that. But that share of experience and just also that solidaristic coming together and sharing of, you know, emotional experience, I think that's very important. It doesn't secure justice, but it does create relationships, ways of living, ways of looking at the world, which are maybe better than some of those which existed in some places before. And I think, you know, in the absence of justice being delivered by the state, which it's unlikely to be, I think some of those things are worth hanging on for and do make some people's lives, you know, a bit better in some ways for some periods of time.
Thank you. And perhaps a nice response to that of room for optimism then is perhaps a good place to finish. So thank you so much for everybody's questions, and really thank you to Steve for a really insightful conversation on this. Well, up here it's a gloomy Tuesday evening, but hopefully it's brighter. You are. And yeah, thank you for giving your time, both Steve and everybody else, for coming along. If you're interested in coming along to any of our future events, we have an event, Colonial Virus, COVID-19 Myths, Race and Racialization in Ghana, South Africa and Kenya by Dr. Leona Vaughan and Dr. Alain Kinkono in May, on May 11th. So keep an eye out for that on our Eventbrite page. We will be posting the recording of this on our YouTube channel shortly, and I'll send an email out when that's up there to everybody who registered, so that you'll be able to have the link to that to share and watch at your leisure. So again, thank you very much to Steve, and thank you all for coming along.
Thank you very much, and thanks for the comments in the chat. It's really, really nice. I really enjoyed it. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Good night.
Bye-bye.